Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this exciting conversation with Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow. I'm Sarah Curmi, and I am the Executive Director of Sister District. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight in partnership with Vote Mama. A big thank you to them to have this fireside chat with Michigan State Senator, candidate for US Senate, and author Mallory McMorrow to talk about her amazing book, Hate Won't Win: Find Your Power and Leave This Place Better Than You Found It. Briefly, in terms of agenda, I'm going to share a few words about Sister District and a few framing thoughts about the book, and then introduce the senator, and we will dive right in. On the housekeeping front, we have closed captioning, and we'll post instructions in the chat. We are also recording, and we will post the recording on our website. We may have time for audience Q&A, so please post questions in the chat. My apologies ahead of time if things run long and we aren't able to get to all of your questions. And please let us know in the chat where you're zooming in from. We have folks from all across the country who have RSVP'd tonight, and we're excited to have you here. As I mentioned, I am the Executive Director of Sister District, where we mobilize our robust grassroots community, deploy best-in-class campaign strategies, and win competitive races to build progressive state legislative majorities across the country. Our co-founders started this organization because they saw a clear gap in organizing capacity and resources going specifically to building power at this level of government. Unfortunately, conservatives have been systematically building power at all levels of government, but especially the state level for the better part of the last century, while progressives have not been quite so disciplined. These state chambers are also extremely important venues of power. They have an outsized impact on every policy we care about, including abortion access, voting rights, environmental protections, gun safety, equality, and so much more. And as that shines through in the senator's book, the health and future of our democracy really depends on our willingness to engage in these forums and the political process. As we grapple with the actions being taken at the federal level and head into the 2025 and 2026 election, I think it's such an important time to be in community and remind ourselves why we have stepped into this fight, why our work matters, and hopefully inspire others to join us. And that's why I'm thrilled to be here with the senator who, after Googling how to run for office in the wake of the 2016 election, took on an incumbent Republican state senator as a first-time candidate and won. In 2023, she became the first woman Senate Majority Whip in Michigan history and only the second senator in state history to give birth while in office. Her writing has appeared in Road and Truck, Jalopnik, Jezebel, The New York Times, NBC News, CNN, and The New Republic. She lives with her husband Ray and her daughter Noah in Royal Oak, Michigan. Hate Won't Win is her first book, and of course, we are extremely proud at Sister District to call her an alum and to be here tonight to discuss it. This book covers both the story of the senator's entry into politics and key moments of her tenure in office, including, of course, the speech, which we will get into later. And it is also really a guide for how to get involved, complete with the workbook and exercises. Some of the big themes that shine through are, particularly in a post-pandemic world, we remain disconnected from one another. And in many ways, social media only exacerbates these divides. The health of our democracy depends on us and our willingness to engage in a real way over the long haul, even if that means redefining victory at times. Women who run and serve in office continue to face unique challenges and systemic barriers despite the progress we have made. And no one leader alone can save us, but we can all step forward and do our part together. And with that foremost, I think this book feels very hopeful, even in its acknowledgement of the very real challenges we face. And I think it could not come at a better time, a moment when it is absolutely critical that we all engage in our democracy in order to preserve it and hopefully strengthen it. So with that, let's dive in and hear from the senator about this amazing book. So, Senator, you discuss in the beginning of the book that you were approached about writing a book right after your famous speech went viral in April of 2022. But you said no initially because you weren't sure what you wanted to say. In perhaps a somewhat prescient turn of events, you decided to use this book to not only tell your story, but also issue a call to action with a workbook on steps folks can take towards meaningful engagement just when we need it most. What led you to taking that approach?
First of all, hi everybody. I see more than 160 of you. I see from California, Portland, Illinois, Sonoma. I saw Oklahoma. I see a bunch of people from Michigan, DC. Just hello, everybody all around the country. Thank you so much for joining me and Sarah and supporting Vote Mama and Sister District, two organizations that are very near and dear to my heart. Yes. So for a little bit of background, some of you may know me when I was wearing a headband and I had my hair up in a bun from what I call in the book the speech. In 2022, I was accused by a Republican colleague of wanting to groom and sexualize kindergartners and wanting 8-year-olds to believe they were responsible for slavery, because that is the political moment that we live in. And I gave a speech in response, truly believing this was the last speech I was ever going to give as an elected official. I had been really deflated by my lack of ability to get things done in the legislature after I got elected in 2018. I had flipped a Republican district and the Republican majority ostracized me. So I introduced dozens of bills on every single issue I ran on. I'd never gotten a single hearing, and I was in a really dark place where I had felt like I had let a lot of people down, people who knocked doors for me, people who donated to me. And I was convinced that I had failed. So I gave this speech in which I declared myself as a straight white Christian married suburban mom who knows that hate will only win when people like me stand by and let it happen. I made it a point to pivot what is usually an attack levied on the LGBTQ community to talk about myself, as a member of the majority, as somebody who wasn't really under attack, but to say that people who are different are not the reason why healthcare costs are too high or why housing costs are too high. And that speech blew up overnight. I put a video of it up online. Within 24 hours, it was viewed tens of millions of times. I was on CNN and MSNBC and PBS NewsHour and Fox News, and Laura Ingraham called me liberal Karen with a headband, and I got a phone call from the president, and, crazy overnight. And right away, in the aftermath of going viral, I had more than a dozen offers from publishers who wanted me to write a book. And there were a lot of people who said, you have to do it right now. This is your moment. If you don't do it right now, people will forget who you are and it's not going to matter. I did not know what I wanted to write in that moment. I had always wanted to write a book. It had been a dream of mine, but we had work to do. So we were in a moment where, thanks to redistricting in Michigan, we had fair legislative maps for the first time in my lifetime. And instead of writing a book, I opened a PAC. I leveraged the spotlight of the speech to raise millions of dollars for other candidates running in our state Senate, and helped us flip control of the legislature for the first time since 1984. But in the process of that work, I traveled the country. I was in more than a dozen states over from April to November of 2022. And no matter where I was, when I was talking to people in red states or blue states, I was talking to grandparents against gun violence. I met with the NHL and the superintendents of state parks and all kinds of groups. And everywhere I went, people said, I'm so overwhelmed. I want to do something. I don't know where to start. And that became this book. It was the process of this whole year and going through this experience that made me realize this is the book that I want to write. Number one, tearing down any idea that I had any idea what I was doing. I was in no way special. As Sarah mentioned, I Googled how to run for office in the wake of the 2016 election. So wherever you are in this moment, just know that you are probably ahead of where I was, and that all of us can use our voice and find our motivation and get engaged. So it really is a guide, a step-by-step guide for anybody to find your motivation, find your voice, learn how to tell a compelling story, learn how to engage with elected officials based on what I've learned, both as an outsider and then as an insider, and with some interviews and stories of other people who have inspired me in a way that I hope inspires you, because in this moment, we need all of us. We need all of us to get engaged, to do something, to step up. And if you're all here tonight, you are well on your way to making a difference and taking our country back. At a moment we're sitting here right now and Republicans are ripping away healthcare from millions of Americans all across the country, but we can make a difference. And that's what this book is.
Absolutely, and that's what I came away with, and I found it really accessible, but also as someone who's been doing this a long time, also, I still learned some things and, found it very, interesting and exciting. So, of course, we have to talk about the speech. You've already, talked about it a little bit, as it's dubbed in the book, "The Speech," and we all know that, of course, it went viral, catapulting you to fame across the country, provoking a resounding response. What you also share in the book, though, is that the speech seemed to me as a reader to be something of a turning point for you, as you had been pondering not even running for reelection prior to it. Would you describe it as a turning point? And if so, can you talk about how that speech and the response helped you realize your impact and the way you could use your platform and your voice in the future?
Yeah, I think something that was really hard, 2018 was dubbed the year of the woman, where all of a sudden, in the wake of the 2016 election, there were women all across the country at every level who raised their hand and said, I want to try to fix this. I was a part of an organization called Emerge, which had a chapter in Michigan, and I joined and was suddenly with 22 women from all across the state of Michigan, of all different backgrounds, of all different ages, who I think, unlike a lot of politicians, traditional politicians, none of us were in the room because we always wanted to be a representative or a senator, but because for some reason, we saw these problems in our community and nobody seemed to be fixing them. I talk in the book about some of my classmates in Emerge. One woman was in her 70s, a Black woman from Detroit who had lived through the 1967 riots and said that this is the worst time she's ever lived through, that it has never been this bad and that she can't sit on the sidelines anymore. One of my classmates was a scientist who was horrified by the anti-science, anti-fact rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration or, the Trump campaign, and knew that she wanted to step up. Another woman in my class ran a childcare center and just watched as childcare centers were getting squeezed further and further, and parents couldn't afford childcare and knew that she had to step up and fix it. So all of us were there because we saw problems that needed to be addressed, and infuriatingly, nobody was fixing them. And that was how I got into this. And then, there was kind of this romanticizing, not to say that it wasn't easy for any of us who ran in 2018. It was hard as hell. And thank you to Sister District. I quite literally would not be in office without Sister District. We could talk more about what they did for me later and why it's such an incredible organization. But there was this kind of feeling that all of these women are stepping up and all of us are going to take power and then we're going to fix things. And when I got into office, I suddenly found I did not have the power I thought I had. I had a title, I was a senator, but I was sexually harassed by a colleague on new senator orientation day. Believe it or not, during the break of sexual harassment training, because life is like an episode of Veep and you have to be able to laugh at it. Uh, I never got a bill hearing. I was targeted even in my first campaign with a mailer that had a picture of me drinking a margarita by a pool and it had a curling iron on it. And the curling iron said, vote no on McMorrow. So I really, 3 years into my first term, felt like I had failed. I had never gotten a bill hearing. I had never gotten anything signed into law. And I felt like all of these people believed in me and had my back, and I had nothing to show for it. So I gave this speech, and really, my thought process was if I'm going to go down, I might as well go down swinging because this is it. And almost immediately, yes, there was a lot of news coverage, but more important than that, I got letters and emails and phone calls from thousands of people all across the country, all across the world. I mean, my PO box was stuffed for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. And even to this day, I mean, it is years later now, and people tell me that they've saved the speech. They watch it sometimes when they want to get kind of pumped up, and it's so moving. And it pulled me back from a really dark place. And all of the sudden, I had all of these people all across the country who saw me for who I was and supported me and said, "We have your back." And I realized that it didn't matter that I had a title. It didn't matter that I hadn't passed any legislation. I was so laser focused on this narrow set of what success means, that I lost sight of the fact that we were making a difference and I could use my voice and I could use my platform. So just thank you to everybody who reached out, who donated. I mean, we had donations from all over the country for my campaign and my reelection, and I can't express to you how meaningful it was. And what I realized is that anybody can do that. And we're looking for people who feel the same anger and passion that we feel so that we know we're not alone.
Absolutely. And we're so glad you stayed in the fight. So, switching gears a little bit, the book also talks about political science professors Eitan Hirsch's book, The Politics is for Power, and his definition of political hobbyism, which was a new term for me, but one I found very apt as I read more about it. Can you talk about what the term means and why it can be dangerous?
Absolutely. So once again, for those who want to know what this is, Eitan Hirsch wrote a book a few years ago called Politics is for Power. And I assign it to every new activist group that I meet with because it really kind of took me aback when I first read it. And I interviewed Professor Hirsch for the book as well. But he's really critical, particularly of the way that those of us who consider ourselves democratic or progressive engage with politics. We all know people who are really political in our life. And too often, what that looks like is constantly watching MSNBC or CNN or being plugged into Twitter or Blue Sky 24 hours a day, constantly engaging in what's going down in DC. The number of people who know, the look on James's face when they first took the case and it was reported on national news, or that Lauren Boebert, gave a hand job to a guy during a Beetlejuice concert, and all of these things that really don't matter. And I say don't matter in the terms of what politics actually is, which is building power to make change in your community. So all of those things, the kind of like drama of politics, isn't really politics at all. And he coins that political hobbyism. So that is really treating politics the same way you would treat sports. I am here in Michigan. If you are a Lions fan, you hate the Packers. And between the Lions and the Packers, that's fine. And you can have the rhetoric that says, I hate them, I want them to lose. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It's a game. But when it comes to politics, it's not a game. These are our lives. These are our kids' lives. These are our fundamental rights. This is our democracy. And he has an anecdote in the book that haunts me to this day, so much so that I shared it in my book. And he talked about a neighborhood in Appalachia where there was a high rate of opioid addiction, and that there was a group that started reaching out to people in the neighborhood to offer help and support and reach out for them and give them a place to stay and have pamphlets. The group that was doing that was the KKK. And he points out that, if you're going through what is the hardest time in your life, if you're going through addiction, and you see the only person reaching out to offer you a hand to help, you are going to want to help them. You're going to feel indebted to them. And if the KKK is doing that, you are building members of the KKK. So for all of the time, it may seem harmless to be doom scrolling and, fighting with your racist uncle on Facebook. But just think of, for all the time that you're doing that, it feels terrible. I don't know about you, but if I watch cable news nonstop and I'm doom scrolling until midnight, I don't feel good. But it's also not doing what politics actually is, which is building power to make change. So that's just something that I want us all to think about, because it's really easy to get sucked into the drama of politics and the entertainment of politics. But for every moment we're doing that, somebody else, likely with lesser motives, is out there building power. And that's how we have to check ourselves on how we spend our time.
Absolutely. And so, relatedly, you discuss the importance of forging real life connections with people in our communities and becoming actively engaged in the political process instead of simply consuming the news via social media, digital media, cable news. And as an organization that mobilizes volunteer teams throughout the country to support legislative candidates running in critical seats, we couldn't agree with that sentiment more. Can you share how this type of active engagement is an antidote to the dangers of political hobbyism and central to the future of our democracy?
Oh, totally. And first of all, I just want to think about your own mental health. I tell people all the time, if you spend one less hour doom scrolling and spend that hour knocking on doors, I guarantee you, you will feel so much better. Truly. It was something that I was terrified to do when I was new at this. I started volunteering for local city commission candidates before I decided to run myself. And just the idea that, wait a second, I'm going to go knock on a stranger's door and I'm going to talk about campaigns and like that's just a strange thing. But the more you do it, it's like a muscle. You know, you're not going to have it right away. You practice and you practice and you practice. And what I found was it re-engaged my love for my community and for my state. I met so many people who I never would have met otherwise, who, you know, had different cultures and different backgrounds, but we found a shared love of dogs and our kids and the lakes, and you know, and it just really restores your faith in humanity. And also when we think about how we actually make change, it is a numbers game. um, you have to have more people on your side to vote in favor of either candidates or policies that support the change you want to make. So if you are sticking to just your circle of people, you're not actually growing in your numbers. So one of the exercises that I have in the book challenges you to network your neighborhood. And it asks, do you actually know everybody in your neighborhood? Now, if you live in an urban environment, that could be like, do I know everybody in my building? If you're in the suburbs, it's, do I know everybody within 3 blocks of my house? If you're way out in the country, maybe it's the closest 5 to 10 houses. And there's fascinating research from Pew that shows that actually the closer you live, the less likely you are to know people. So people who live in cities very likely don't know the people in their building. People way out in the country very likely know the people around them. But if you actually build those relationships, then when it comes time for an election, maybe you're the person that your neighbor texts to say, hey, who are you voting for? Or is there an election? I know I've become that person. Yes, I'm a state senator, but also just for neighbors to say, who is this person running for school board? Or who are these people running for judge? And you can become the resource that actually makes the change we want to see in our community. And the best thing that I've done just for my own mental health is like, this thing goes away at night. It is in a different room. So it is not the last thing that I'm looking at before I go to bed. And it's not the first thing that I pick up in the morning.
When I read that, I immediately very much admired you. So I'm gonna have to work to that.
It's
I'll
hard. You feel like nervous about it.
yes, I'm gonna have to work to that. But I admire that you've gotten there already. Switching gears a little bit again, in your book, you discuss and share your own personal experience, as you alluded to earlier, with a number of issues, such as threats to personal safety, sexual harassment in the workplace, and paid family leave that impact women, and in this context, women legislators, more disproportionately and/or more severely. When I myself left the Senate as a staffer in 2015, Democrats were in the superminority, and there was only one Democratic woman and no women of color in the caucus. Of course, now Democrats are in the majority, and it's a majority woman caucus with 11 of 19 members. How do you think having a majority and having more women and women of color at the table and in leadership has changed the culture and the policy making of the chamber?
It is night and day. And, you know, I campaigned partially on the fact that we are at risk of having no women Democratic senators if we didn't get elected. Luckily, in 2018 and then subsequently in 2022, a lot more women got elected in the Senate. So now we are a majority woman, majority caucus. And just the nature of having more women in power means that the way the legislature operates is very different. It was culture shock coming into a governing body from the private sector. I felt like I traveled back in time to the 1950s. Sexual harassment was the norm, misogyny was the norm. There were no rules around women giving birth and what that meant. There was no paid leave. There was no leave policy when I gave birth, and we kind of had to chart our own course. And I took a risk. I took a leave, even though we don't technically have one. And I made the case to my voters that it is important to have working moms at the table. And my hope was that they would support me in that. But I mentioned up top, there was a colleague of mine who sexually harassed me on day one. And after working my ass off for a year and a half to raise the money and knock the doors and flip a district, it was so demoralizing. This was, somebody I walked up and I introduced myself to him. He put his hand around my body and held what I can only describe as my upper ass while looking me up and down. And he asked who I had beaten to get into office. And I told him, and he looked me up and down and said, "I can see why." And it was so deflating, that all of that work meant nothing. But as a lot of women are taught, I buried it down. I went home. I told my husband how mortified I was, but I didn't want this to be the first thing that I did as a senator. So I didn't tell anybody. And then months later, he did the same thing to a 22-year-old reporter who had tried to interview him for a story about a Facebook group. I think it was called The People versus Gretchen Whitmer. And it was really horrendous. I mean, there were death threats and rape threats against not only the governor, but many women elected officials in Michigan. And it had sort of blown up that there were multiple Republican elected officials in this Facebook group. So this reporter was trying to get a comment from him about his membership in this group. And instead of taking a question, he stood in front of a group of high school students, boys from an all boys school that were there. And he joked to this reporter, this 22-year-old young woman, that you should stick around because these boys could have a lot of fun with you. And they all started laughing. And Allison wrote a story about this and how she knew exactly what it was. This was locker room talk. They effectively made a gang rape joke about her. And I came forward with my story, knowing I could back Allison up. So this was 6 months into my first term, and I saw that he was dragging her through the mud and set out to destroy her new career. And I filed a report saying, what he did to me. And then there was a third woman, a lobbyist, came forward and said that he had done the same thing. There was a long investigation. They interviewed 26 people, all three of us, and they concluded that even though there was no video evidence and they couldn't with no doubt confirm that it happened, that in all likelihood, these events happened in the way that the three accusers described. He lost a chair position, but he ran for Macomb County prosecutor and he won, which is horrifying to think about. But one of the stories I talk about in the book is, I got a lot of outreach from staff. Sarah, you mentioned being on staff, and women who had horror stories, a list of lobbyists you don't go out to drinks with and people whose offices you shouldn't go into. And so many women thanked me for coming forward. But it really took more women getting into office because now we just operate differently. Many of us have kids, we have families. We don't want the old boys club where, people didn't want to go home at night. They didn't want to go to their families. So it was very common to have late dinners and late drinks and stay over. Now we have more coffee meetings because we have lives and we're busy, and you can have a meeting with us before session starts so that we can go home at the end of the afternoon. And that creates a safer work environment for staff. It creates a safer work environment for reporters and anybody who works in the Capitol. And from when I came in to now, it's not perfect. I will say that it is still very much an old boys club in many ways, but we have made a lot of progress. And a lot of that is because a lot more women ran for office and won and are changing the way that we operate in a way that is safer for everybody.
100%. And thank you for coming forward. So you also talk in the book about having to find and redefine success as you're oftentimes working towards a very big goal, which is something that really resonated with me, having done this work a long time in various political landscapes. And I think underscores the importance of Sister District's mission to invest in states over the long haul. I think we are also all very cognizant that we're in a moment where folks are rightly very scared and outraged by what's happening at the federal level, and therefore they are anxious for dramatic action and results. I'm curious how you thread that needle when talking with folks, and also if you and how you perhaps had to adjust your own expectations of victory once you were elected.
Yeah, I mean, especially after those first few years of not passing anything into law, and it wasn't because there was a lack of good ideas. I am somebody. I lost the older brother of one of my best friends in the Virginia Tech shooting. So gun violence is incredibly personal to me, and year after year after year in my first term, I introduced just a resolution to recognize Gun Violence Awareness Month. And for the first 3 years, they wouldn't even adopt that. And I was at my wits' end. I gave a speech year after year after year, bemoaning the fact that we can't even acknowledge that gun violence exists. How are we actually going to solve this crisis if we can't even get there? But what was missing for me in that moment was that victory takes a lot of forms, and that year after year after year, there were more women and men and kids coming to Moms Demand Action advocacy days. The groups got bigger and bigger and bigger, and that we were winning in more elections. There were people who were passionate about this issue who were winning, and there were more local city councils and commissions that were passing resolutions to recognize Gun Violence Awareness Month. And it took 5 years, and this is the through line of my book. My first bill ever signed into law created Michigan's red flag law, which creates a stopgap, a preventative measure for somebody who is an immediate risk to themselves or others. Maybe they're threatening suicide or they're threatening to hurt their domestic partner, to allow for firearms to be confiscated temporarily from that individual. And it didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of press that the Michigan State shooting suddenly made all of these laws go into effect, that the legislature acted very quickly in response. I will say that the Michigan State shooting was a catalyst to push a lot of this legislation over the line. But, my bill, I worked on it for 5 years. Robert Wittenberg, who was a representative, worked on it for years before I did. There was a gun violence prevention caucus that had been around for a decade before this got done. So that's what I talk about in the book. And I also interview Shannon Watts, who's the founder of Moms Demand Action, who she really redefines success in states like Arkansas. She talked about maybe you're not going to pass safe storage laws and red flag laws, but that there was a bill that had been passed into law that would have allowed open carry at football games and at tailgates. And what she said to me, she's like, think about that combination. You're a college student, you send them away to college and you want them to be safe, and you have guns mixed with beer. That is a lethal combination. And Moms Demand Action organized in Arkansas, and they had a carve out. There was an amendment later to that legislation that would have protected tailgates. And they were like, is that the greatest victory for gun violence prevention? No, but it is a victory. And then you saw people coming out and organizing and getting involved. So I think right now it can be overwhelming to want to respond to everything that is coming out of the Trump administration. So I would say start small. um, it can feel really good to email your US senators and your member of Congress and fill out every change.org petition, but think about that's just a little drop across many things. What if you went deep on one issue and you got to know your state representative and your state senator and your member of council, and maybe, thinking about my example, maybe this isn't the year that you pass the law, but maybe there's a resolution in your city council to recognize your issue. And that's progress. And over time, it builds into something much bigger.
Absolutely. So, another topic you discussed towards the end of the book that really spoke to me was the concept of the fallacy of heroes, which talks about how we can fall into a trap of expecting that our elected officials and leaders will save us. Can you talk more about how that belief is dangerous to the health of our democracy?
Yeah, so one of my heroes was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she was brilliant. And not just for her accomplishments, but for the way that she thought. In the book, I talk about one of her first cases that really started to chip away at the idea of gender equality was she took up a case of discrimination based on sex, not against women, but against men in the South, I think maybe it was Arkansas or Oklahoma, it was legal for women to buy beer when they were 18, but it was not legal for men to buy beer until they were 21. So she found this case that was making its way throughout lower courts and she took it up. And the reason that she did this was that she looked at the all male Supreme Court justices and said, if she were to put up a case of gender discrimination against women, they wouldn't agree, not out of any malicious intent, but because as men, they could not wrap their heads around it. If they had never been discriminated against because of their gender, they simply would not understand that it was possible. So the brilliance of her taking this case was she was talking in the language of her audience. She recognized that to this panel of men, if she were to bring this case of this poor boy who was not allowed to buy beer because he wasn't deemed demure enough like the women, and they ruled in her favor. And that is how I think about storytelling and how I make my case. I always think about the audience. But, as she got older and she shifted from being a justice to a cultural icon to becoming the notorious RBG, and there was gear and there was Halloween costumes and merch and books, and, she became larger than life. And one of the things I talk about in the book is, there was coverage of her workout routine, and it's this octogenarian, teeny tiny 70-pound Jewish woman doing side planks. And somehow we were all convinced, she's just going to live through it. There's no way that she can. And the case that I make is that maybe sometimes we hold up our heroes to the point that they're not human anymore. And it gives us the freedom not to take responsibility ourselves. We're like, no, she's got it. She's going to stay alive. She's going to defeat Donald Trump. She's a human and we're all human, no matter who our elected officials are. I always get very weirded out now that when I'm approached by a reporter who says, you're a star of the Democratic Party. I'm sorry, we're not celebrities, we're people. I am a mom, I get tired, I get sick, I work really hard, but we can't do any of this alone. So, I hope that we do have heroes, but instead of treating them as superhuman and that they're going to do everything and we're just going to be here to bask in their glory, we should be inspired by them to be a part of their team because they need us, because they are human and they're fallible. And, I also cringe anytime I hear mostly Democratic politicians say, this is the most important election of our lifetimes, because it implies if you just vote hard enough for this one person, then everything is going to be fixed. And no wonder everybody is so angry and let down all the time because there's no way one person, even the best candidate for president, is going to fix everything. We have to do it and be a part of that solution with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that dovetails really nicely with the next question, which is that threaded throughout the book are stories of real people who really stepped into their power and answered the call to action, even after some of them experienced really devastating events. Can you share what you've learned from these folks and how their stories help you keep going when the fight gets tough?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about Shannon, and I interviewed two people for the book and kind of put their stories side by side. Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action, and Brandon Wolf, who is now the press secretary for the Human Rights Campaign, but he was a Pulse nightclub shooting survivor. And I was intentional in kind of putting their examples side by side because Brandon, was never active in politics. He had moved from his hometown where he had, all things considered, a pretty normal, healthy middle class upbringing. But as a gay Black kid, didn't feel like he belonged. So he up and moved to Florida with no job and, got a job at Disney and made friends. And he found a friend group that he finally felt like he had a family. And to hear him tell his story of the Pulse nightclub shooting and losing his best friends, Drew and Juan, and how that really pushed him into action. He testified in front of John Lewis in Congress about the shooting. And when I interviewed him, he said part of it is because it's to keep their stories alive and their memories alive, but also to humanize things like gun violence and loss. Because when you hear statistics, you hear 24 people were shot, this many kids were shot. It's just a number, but you hear Drew's story and Juan's story and feel who they were as people and how they made me feel like I belonged and realize that that story is magnified every time this happens to somebody that has pushed him into advocacy and action. He's somebody that I actually met at an event at Affirmations, which is an LGBTQ community center in Ferndale, Michigan. He was campaigning for Elizabeth Warren for president in the presidential cycle, and he and I were on a panel together. I'd never met him. And to hear him tell this story, I mean, just exuded joy in a way that was so inspiring to me when you talk about really heart-wrenching um, trauma. To feel joy was something that I hadn't expected, and it was really powerful. So he talks about, his life's goal is not to solve all of these problems, but he imagines it like somebody's passed the baton to him and he's going to pass it to somebody else. And hopefully by the end of his life, he's further along in terms of LGBTQ equality and gun violence prevention than where he started. That's his goal, not perfection, but progress. And for Shannon, I think her story is important because she didn't experience gun violence personally the way that Brandon did. She woke up one morning and saw um, a school shooting on TV, and just as a mom felt what happened to this country where we can watch babies, elementary school students, be killed in their classroom and not do something about it. And that she leveraged her background. She had worked for GE Health and a bunch of other corporate clients and in comms and PR. So she was used to executive storytelling and she knew how to do communications and marketing. And somehow she leveraged that background kind of unknowingly. And she created a Facebook group trying to say there have to be a bunch of other moms that feel the way that I do. And it blew up overnight. So she talks through, leveraging her career background to do things like the red t-shirts that are now synonymous with Moms Demand Action. They all match. You see them. That is her unique career background that she's now leveraged into making a difference. So I shared their two stories to help people see how you can find your motivation. It may not be always that obvious, but you can kind of find your path to figure out what drives you to stay engaged, not just once, not just around the election, but every single day, because that's how we're going to make change. And it has to come from the heart. It has to be personal and it has to drive you.
Yes, thank you. So, another theme throughout the book is the importance of taking action at the state and local level, with a particular affinity for state legislatures, to which we at Sister District can all relate. Can you talk about what led you to choose to run for state senate over another level of office in the first place, and how you believe state legislatures can play a critical role in our path forward in the fight for democracy and our fundamental freedoms?
Yeah, look, I'll be the first to admit, again, this is a lot of us sharing that in the wake of 2016, I did not know that much about my state legislators. Like I think a lot of people do. In the book, I point out that 80% of Americans do not know who their state legislators are. So if you don't know, don't be ashamed. That's okay. Most people don't. Um, And so much of the media attention focuses on what's happening in DC with the White House and Congress and the US Senate and all the drama that I talked about and kind of that political hobbyism. when most of the most important decisions that impact your everyday life happen in your state legislature. So there's a stark difference between healthcare outcomes depending on the state that you live in, on gun violence prevention, on water quality, on school outcomes, depending on whether or not your state invests and cares about public education. And too often, people are paying attention only to what's happening in Washington and don't know what's happening on the local level. So, in the wake of the 2016 election, I really was digging in and getting to know who represents me at every level. And I felt like there was such a disconnect between my state senator and my community. This was somebody who kind of fashioned himself as a moderate Republican, but was cutting education funding, was harming teachers, was blocking all gun violence prevention measures, was cozying up with polluters and cutting out their requirements to have to pay if they polluted our water in ways that I just felt was so damaging. So I decided to run against him. He won his district by 16 points in 2014. So even our local Democratic Party leaders told me that's cute. You have no chance of winning, but don't worry, you'll build your name recognition. You can run for something smaller next time. It was also very strange because I would meet people who were like, why aren't you running for Congress? Because again, the only thing that people care about is Congress and Washington. And they just didn't, this was like a weird middle level that people didn't consider. So we won. We flipped a district 20 points in one cycle, thanks in no small part to Sister District, who believed in me, invested in me, supported me, knocked doors with me. And this is one of the most important levels of government. And to put a kind of a fine point on it, during Barack Obama's presidency, Democrats lost almost 1,000 state legislature seats across the country, gave control of two-thirds of state legislatures to Republicans. And when we think about something like the fall of Roe and the Dobbs decision, that did not happen overnight. That happened because these Republican-controlled state legislatures passed more extreme abortion bans intentionally designed to be challenged up to eventually a conservative Supreme Court. So if we had actually protected state legislatures and invested in state legislatures and state legislative races the way that Republicans have for decades, we may have been able to prevent the fall of Roe. So that's something that I think about all the time, which is how these are races that are decided sometimes by hundreds of votes and thousands of dollars, not millions of dollars, where you can make a real impact on the future of your state and the future of our country.
Absolutely. We couldn't agree more. So we have a couple audience questions, and folks, feel free to also continue to put questions in the chat if you've got them. One person wrote in and is really curious about how they can continue to stay up to date with you and your campaign and get plugged in, perhaps over the summer.
Oh, amazing. Well, hello. Yes, I am very excited to now be running for United States Senate. And you may be asking yourself why. You just told me about the importance of state legislatures. For me, it is so important that in a state like Michigan, we have a real partner in the US Senate to build on the success that we have made on the state level, to be a real partner in understanding the budget process, the bills that we're passing, but somebody who's also a fighter. This feels like an existential moment in our country. And we need somebody who's going to stand up and meet people where they are and fight for a future. And if you want to learn more or volunteer or donate, our website is mcmorrowformichigan.com. We will be all over the state over the next year and a half. A lot of time to get to know everybody. And I can't wait to see you and would love to have you on our campaign.
Amazing. And then another question from someone is asking, since you're running for US Senate, are you having to be a different politician, given that there is a greater diversity of voters statewide in Michigan?
Ooh, that's a great question. First of all, I think that people have finally attuned bullshit meters. So if you suddenly change who you are, I think people pick up on that. I won and ran office in a Republican district in Oakland County. So for those of you who are not Michiganders, it is a fairly wealthy suburb. We had a lot of people who their kids had left Michigan. So when I was knocking doors, I heard a lot of voters say, "You remind me a lot of my daughter who left and went to New York or Chicago or Denver or California. Why are you in Michigan? And what can we do to bring my kids back?" And that idea, that value, I think is far above and beyond, kind of political purity tests. I also won re-election to the state Senate in a very Democratic district. With redistricting in 2022, I went from a Republican district to a Democratic district, now representing a good portion of Detroit and some of the suburbs. And I have never changed who I am. I'm pragmatic and responsive. I love to be a strong communicator. If you follow me on Instagram, I hope you do. I'm at Mallory McMorrow. Something I started doing around the election was Ask Me Anything, where almost once a week, once every couple of weeks, I post Ask Me Anything. I get hundreds of questions from people on everything from what's the difference between a bill and a resolution, to is protesting effective and what do we do afterwards? Some people ask me what's my favorite Bluey episode and who's my favorite football team. It's just a really good way to get to know people. Um, but I will always be who I am, and who I am is a problem solver. So as I get across the state, obviously it's a much larger electorate, but I go in with the same mindset of curiosity and trying to understand, how are you doing? What do you need? What are the gaps? And how can we solve those problems? But coming back to that kind of original value of making Michigan a place where we see opportunity and where our kids are going to stay, I think is going to resonate statewide, and we'll see.
Sure. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, it looks like someone just popped in. How do Democrats change their message to attract swing voters?
Oh my gosh, this is my favorite question. Number one, do not lecture people. So think about any interaction you've ever had. I try to do this on the doors, or anytime I'm having a conversation or when I'm in the grocery store. I think people are really exhausted by politics. So if you kind of come in hot with your policy priorities or being really critical of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, which we absolutely should be, because oh my God, how are we surviving this moment? You have to build trust as a person first. And as I think about swing voters, they're really burned out, they're really exhausted, and I think this is across the board. Outside of those of us who are on these sorts of calls or who are really plugged in, most people don't think about politics, and they don't want to think about politics. So I think approaching every conversation or interaction you have with a person like they're a person. Who are you? Where do you live? Tell me about your family. What do you do for a living? Something that is my favorite thing to do when I'm knocking on doors is I find one thing on their porch that I really like. I am a terrible gardener, so if somebody has great flowers, I ask them about it. And just starting a conversation where we get to know each other, even just in a short amount of time, before you get into, here's my pitch. Because if you come in, it comes across like you're a salesperson and nobody wants to be sold something. They want to build a relationship first, and then that opens the door for you to start talking about policy and Democrats and voting in elections in a way that maybe they'll pick up on because they see that you actually have something in common and you're there as a neighbor, and not as somebody selling something.
Yes, for sure. So then we've got, have you been able to connect with other sister district candidates in Michigan, and have you learned from them?
Oh, yes. I mean, many of us ran together in 2018. And Sister District is an incredible organization because it targets swing districts in swing states. So it can be a very unique and lonely, isolating experience for those of us who are running in swing districts like mine, where even local party officials were like, you don't have a chance. We're not going to support you. To know that you have the support of an organization that is there to help you really matters. And we've stayed in touch. There are some volunteers of mine who came out in 2018 for GOTV, Get Out the Vote, and we're here on the ground in person in Michigan, that have come back subsequent cycles for other candidates, which has been such a joy to go to, state house kickoffs and see the same people who were out for me in 2018 out again. Is just, it's wonderful. I mean, these are relationships. Just all of this is about building relationships, and these are relationships that I'm going to keep for life.
Absolutely. We had someone else write in and ask how you maintain your optimism.
Number one, putting my phone down. No, but truly, so The ask me anything just on my social media has been, it's something that I started doing the day after the election because I was so depressed and I could not pull myself off my couch and I didn't want to put makeup on or like do my hair. And for some reason, I don't know why, but I was just like, I'm having a shit day. I bet a bunch of people are too. Ask me anything and we'll get through it together. But the fact that every time I do that, I get hundreds of questions from all across the country. Um, I'm optimistic because it shows that people haven't given up. I think that was my biggest fear in the wake of this cycle, that, we had been through a Trump presidency and people still wanted to vote for this again. I think I took that really hard for what that meant for us as a country. But people aren't giving up and they're showing up every single day. And I also have a 4-year-old, and she is probably the most hilarious person I've ever met. And just spending some time with her and not looking at the news or looking at my phone, that makes me optimistic because we have to make a country that's worthy of her. She's got to have a lot to look forward to. And Sarah, your kid too. They can hang out.
Absolutely. 4-year-olds have a way of making you smile no matter what. So we have, let's see, I think we have time for maybe a couple more quick ones. Were you interested in politics in high school or college, and did you hold an office then?
No, I did not. So my husband, he was very involved. He was in the debate club when he was in high school, and he worked for Jennifer Granholm on her first campaign to become governor here in Michigan. So in my mother-in-law's house, I actually found a binder, and it's a binder full of printed MapQuest maps, and it's labeled the "Do Not Get Jennifer Lost" book. And that was my husband's job, was to drive Jennifer Granholm around the state, and he didn't get her lost. So great. But I was not, I tangentially paid attention, but this wasn't anything that I was really into. I was an artist. I went to school for industrial design. I was a car designer, and then I worked at Mattel as a senior designer over global branding and licensing for Hot Wheels. I saw the Barbie movie the day it came out, if anybody wants to talk about the Barbie movie. But this was, I think, like a lot of people, I voted, I sort of paid attention, but I wasn't as involved as I should have been. I didn't realize how, my lack of participation meant that other people were making decisions about my life for me without my participation. And I had no right to be angry or frustrated if I wasn't as engaged as I was. So, me Googling how to run for office after 2016 really was my first big step into recognizing I haven't been doing enough and I'm late, but I'm going to start. And I stopped making fun of my husband. I used to make fun of him for watching debates all the time on TV, even from other states. He was very into it, and I was not. So, all that is to say, you don't have to have gone to college for this. I didn't. I meet high school students all the time who say they want to go major in political science, and I'm like, that's great. I'm a car designer. But we need, government should be made up of all kinds of different people with all kinds of different backgrounds. And for me, I think something that has been a strength of my background is, as an industrial designer, my thought process is problem solving. You see a problem, you come up with 1,000 different ideas and you test them and you focus group them and you build prototypes and you see how they work. And then you put something out in the market. And if it doesn't work, you do something new. And I think that approach has helped me a lot in this career in a way that, I've learned the political science of it, but the thought process is something that I brought in.
100%. And I couldn't agree more that we need diversity in all ways at the state legislative level. We're going to try to do one more quick one. Alan from San Francisco Bay is asking, what is something that those of us who live in parts of the country that are already very heavily Democratic may not understand or appreciate about districts or communities that are more red or purple?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I will say, so I've lived in 5 states. I grew up in rural New Jersey, went to college in Indiana. I lived in Redondo Beach when I worked at Mattel, and then I was in New York as the creator for Gawker Media. So I've lived in red places and blue places, and now I'm in a very purple place. Uh, I think what a lot of people don't realize is there really are people who have a completely different worldview than you do. When you are in a bubble, um, it can feel like, you watch the election results or you read the news, and it feels like people from a different planet. They're not. There are shared values. I think what Donald Trump has succeeded at is tapping into people's very rightful anger at the fact that they are not doing as well as they had hoped, that they were promised a version of the American dream that has not been available to them. And he's weaponized that to say, you're not succeeding and it's somebody else's fault. So, what I hope that people maybe in very blue areas know about purple areas or even red places is people just want to succeed and they want to have a fair shot and they don't want to be talked down to. And I found that in knocking doors that, showing up without judgment is really hard. I see this playing out online right now where there's a lot of people who there's a little schadenfreude happening where you look at people and it's like, well, Trump voters, you got what you asked for. We have to be willing to give people grace, and that can be really hard because we see how horrible what he's doing is. But people are people and they just want the same things that we do. And that can be hard to see sometimes when you're kind of out of that bubble.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Senator. We know how busy you are, but I really enjoyed the book. I'm going to show it here. I had a great time reading it and great time with this conversation. I hope folks on the call will on the Zoom will go purchase a copy. And we've already, I think, posted some ways to get involved in the senator's next venture, as well as ways to get involved with Sister District. So we hope that you will take the advice of the book and step into your power and help us move forward at this tenuous moment in history.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks
Thank
everybody for
you.
joining.